I have a story from when I was young that is 100% true, but I honestly have no way to prove it, and I'm guessing a lot of people won't believe it. I just want to tell someone the story that will believe it, or at least enjoy it, so here goes. When I was around 12, my best buddy Jordan and I used to spend a lot of time out of the house. Like, a lot of time. We would go to school, and the minute we got off the bus, we would go in, drop off our book bags, and then would be out in the woods until almost 9 or when our parents yelled for us. We would typically skip dinner because we were both young nature enthusiasts and genuinely loved spending time out on the trails. Thankfully, Jordan had an excellent sense of direction and could almost always get us home without issue. Me, on the other hand, I was so bad at figuring out where we were that I could walk 20 feet to the north of where the forest started and be lost. I liked bugs and trees though, so I was always all for it. Now, all of that explains what I loved about being in the woods with Jordan, and how we always had a good time. However, there was a stretch where things weren't quite so fun or comfortable. This happened back in the 80s. I don't remember when exactly, but like I said, I was around 12 or 13. I remember it was in October because all the trees were bright red-orange, and it was my favorite time of the year. If you've never seen a Midwestern fall in the middle of the woods, I highly recommend it. The trees were all covered in oranges, reds, and yellows, and the ground plants were starting to die off. So it was a major contrast between the dead tan and the colorful trees. The first time I knew something was off was on one of the random trips that we took out into the woods. We were playing, and it was starting to get dark pretty early by then. I think we were pretending to be soldiers or something, which is what we typically did, and were stealthily treading through enemy territory. We were hiding behind trees and splitting up to take down the base when I remember hearing something in one of the trees. At first I thought it was a squirrel, and I looked up to see if I could find it, but I didn't see what it was. I ignored it and moved on with what we were playing. After a few more minutes of us doing this, I remember I heard a branch above snapping and thinking, dang, that must be a fat squirrel. But when I looked again, the thing I saw was not a squirrel. I couldn't tell what it was at first, and I remember laughing because I looked over at Jordan and said, "Hey, is that a monkey?" Which was a dumb question because I live in the Midwest and we very clearly do not have monkeys. We both kind of stood there and stared at it, but couldn't figure out what it was because it wasn't really moving, just standing in the tree looking away from us and swaying back and forth. And by swaying, I think the best way to describe it is like a praying mantis. If you've ever seen a praying mantis that feels threatened, they kind of sway back and forth. It was like that. We just watched it for several moments and then tried to kind of walk around the tree to see the front of this thing. But as soon as it noticed us, it ran up the tree and hid to the point that we couldn't find it again. We made plans to come back up the next day and try to see if we could figure out what this thing was, because I was stumped. I was pretty well versed in most of the fauna in our area, because that's what I was into at the time. But this thing was weird. The only thing I could seriously think it looked like was a monkey of some kind. I asked my parents that night if there were any monkeys or apes around us, just to be absolutely certain, and they confirmed there wasn't, aside from the zoo. Obviously, no one had heard anything about an escaped animal from the zoo on the news, so I was back to being stumped. The next day, Jordan and I brought our binoculars to see if we could get a better view, trying to spot this thing. We didn't do much beyond just sitting on a log and watching the trees, seeing if this thing would come back, and it did, but it seemed like it was trying to avoid the area that we were waiting in. So it was like it was aware of us more than something like a squirrel or a rodent or whatever. It wasn't until the 4th day of us staking out the woods that we actually got to see this thing clearly. It was a Saturday, So we had the entire day to stake out the area and see if we could find it. And much to our surprise, when we got into the woods in the morning, we did see it, except it wasn't in the trees. We walked into the wooded area, and no more than 100 feet or so, this thing was on the ground. It looked like it was eating something like a hedge apple, because it was smashing it into the ground and peeling it apart. We went into full stealth mode and crouched behind some of the brush and crept really slowly over to the side so we could see this thing. This is where everything went from, "This is fun, what is this thing?" straight to, "I wish we would have never seen this thing." Whatever this thing was, it was definitely ape-like in structure, but its face looked way too human. If you've ever seen a shaved ape, they have faces similar to humans, but they're discernible. This thing was not. It had a human's face, it was structured like a person, there was nothing there that resembled an animal at all. The mouth was flattened down more like a person's, the nose protruded at an angle like a human's, and the eyes were inset like a human's. We watched this thing eat the hedge apple and then slowly creep up the tree and climb out of sight. After that, I told Jordan that I wanted to go home, and he agreed. Something about seeing this thing, it triggered some kind of deeply inset fear that neither of us had ever experienced. It was like our brains knew that that thing wasn't natural at all, and it wanted us to block it out and never think about it again. We actually took a few weeks off from going into the woods, mostly because we didn't want to see this thing again. We did eventually get the courage to go back, but thankfully we never did see it. I have no idea what it was, but it was definitely not your standard animal from around my part of the world. And the fact that it switched on some kind of primal fear, it was just terrifying. I'm glad we never saw it again, and I'm glad I was able to get this out, because thinking about it sends shivers down my spine and makes me almost feel that same level of terror, even this many years down the road.